Evening wind moves like a slow hand through the cottonwoods. Somewhere ahead, a rider in a black velvet skirt nudges a mare along the river trail, the hoofbeats muffled by sand and last year's leaves. You can hear the bridle ring, the creak of saddle leather, the breathing of a horse that knows this path by heart. The outlaw roads of Indian Territory begin like this, soft, almost gentle, before they twist tight and mean in the timber. And on these roads, the name that rides in whispers is Belle Starr. But before the velvet hat and the six-gun at her waist, there was a girl called May, born Myra Maybelle Shirley on her father's farm near Carthage, Missouri in 1848. She learned to read music with the same seriousness she would later bring to reading men, sensing the measure, the hidden tempo, the off note that needed muting. At Carthage Female Academy, she practiced scales, traced Latin conjugations, and came home to a family that was doing well enough to be noticed. John R. Shirley, farmer-turned-innkeeper and livery owner. Elizabeth Hatfield Shirley, kin, so people like to say, to the storied Hatfields of backwoods fame. The Shirley household was polished when it could be, practical when it had to be. It raised a daughter who could sit proper at a pianoforte and ride astride when the world demanded it. Then the border war tore the map. In Missouri, the Civil War was no neat parade of armies, but a snarl of partisans, raids, and reprisals. Bushwhackers and jayhawkers, neighbors turned night riders. Houses burned, roads turned to rumor. The Shirleys felt the fire's heat. Carthage itself knew the scorch, and the family's foothold in town life slipped. War rearranges people like checkers, and it pushed the Shirleys south, down into Texas, toward a scrubby settlement outside Dallas called Sign. There, along chalky roads and bois d'arc hedgerows, Maybelle learned what the piano never taught, how quickly luck could change, and how a close-lipped woman might survive when it did. Texas in the late 1860s throbbed with men carrying yesterday's grievances in their saddlebags. At the Shirley place, riders passed with the dust of Missouri still on their boots. Names trailed them: Cole Younger, Frank and Jesse James, men who'd ridden the broken edges of the war and now tested the gray area between veteran and outlaw. Some accounts claim the Shirley home served as a hideout for the James Younger crowd passing through. Others caution in that a young woman's proximity to bold names grows grander in the retelling. Either way, Maybelle saw enough to learn the twin currencies of that world: discretion and hospitality. Coffee at midnight, a blanket near the door, no questions asked. In 1866, she married Jim Reed, a handsome man whose best intentions always seemed to arrive 5 minutes late. If Reed could not wrestle prosperity from a plow, he could certainly charm it out of a card game, and charm was a crop that withered quick. Before long, the young couple found themselves moving as much to dodge stories as to chase opportunities. They welcomed a daughter, Rosie Lee, Pearl, in 1868, and a son, James Edwin, Eddie, in 1871. Any mother will tell you that two small children make saints of honest men and liars of the unreliable. For Belle, they became the reason to stretch bread and truth in equal measure. The borderlands between livelihood and lawlessness blur under a high sun. Reed's world blurred faster than most. A missing string of horses here, a rumor about stage money there, a lawman in Arkansas with a paper that had his name on it. Did Maybelle ride the wrong road by choice? Or did the road move under her like a river, stylish one season, criminal the next? Sources disagree. The frontier cared less. It tracked results. A cabin warm at odd hours, fresh horseflesh swapping brands, visitors who came by one name and left by another. The woman keeping the ledger and the coffee pot often sees more than anyone guesses. Whether she planned, abetted, or merely endured the schemes around her remains a historian's scuffle. What is sure is that she learned to make a quiet house louder than a pistol when it needed to be. Historian accounts generally frame Belle's direct involvement with major robberies as uncertain. Contemporary press embellished heavily. If a Texas summer has a single kindness, it is that it announces every visitor well ahead with dust and heat shimmer. Trouble still arrived unannounced in August 1874 near Paris, Texas, and Jim Reed met it at gunpoint. When the smoke drifted off the road and the insects sang again, Maybelle was a widow with 2 children and a reputation rising like a column of campfire sparks. People misremember the order of things. The legend did not make the woman. The woman, embattled, decisive, and unyielding when cornered, made a legend possible. Newspaper and later dime novel treatments would amplify Belle's notoriety after Reed's death. The fact of his killing in 1874 is widely recorded in biographical sources. Widowhood in Reconstruction, Texas was a ledger with more demands than deposits. Work respectable enough to satisfy church eyes did not always feed two young mouths. To the north lay Indian Territory, a vast patchwork of tribal jurisdictions and federal warrants, timbered river bottoms and blind trails. There was room there for ranchers and rustlers alike, and family connections for Maybelle among the Starrs, a Cherokee clan whose name already carried a metallic ring. Along the Canadian River, horses could be traded or hidden, and a determined woman might build a refuge out of planks, river clay, and a talent for keeping counsel. That road through dry creek beds and vine-tangled bends would take the widow Reed to the very place where her later name, Belle Starr, would fix itself to history. It's easy looking back to arrange these years like a straight cattle trail. Life did not grant Belle that neatness. She moved as a survivor moves, toward the next water, the next roof, the next chance to choose for herself. Some nights the only law was the man on your porch, asking in a voice like worn leather if you had a spare blanket and a willing ear. Some mornings the only justice was to saddle up before sun and ride until your thoughts thinned to the sound of hooves. In this drifting school she learned the frontier's hardest lesson. No one is coming to save you. You stand your ground or the ground takes you. And still, she carried the taste of a different life. Polished black keys under her fingers, a dress that fit like a promise. A name whispered not with suspicion, but with admiration. The trail ahead narrows. The Canadian River's out there, a brown ribbon through blackjack, oak, and cane. So are the deputy U.S. Marshals riding out of Fort Smith, their warrants in oilskin, their eyes used to the dark. And a man named Sam Starr waits beyond a bend in the timber, a match head of a future sparking on a damp night. Before she meets him, before the hanging judge speaks her sentence, before the Detroit House of Corrections locks and then opens its doors to her, Belle will make 1,000 small choices that harden into a reputation. Step by step, Maybelle Shirley is becoming Belle Starr, the queen the newspapers will invent, the woman the river country will recognize, and the figure the law will never quite decide to fear or pity. For now she rides beneath the last light, the mare's ears pricking, the air smelling of mud and wood smoke. The road rises to meet her. The outlaw trails are not marked on any map, but she feels them, threading the blackjacks, braiding toward a future shaped like a bend in the river. The wind lifts the edge of her hat. Somewhere back in Missouri, a piano waits in a shuttered room. Out here, the music is hoofbeats and the small, certain clink of a buckle answering the night. They married on a clean, bright morning when the cotton was high and the roads threw chalk dust onto a bride's hem. November 1st, 1866, Collin County, Texas. And the preacher wrote their names as if nothing difficult would ever be asked of them. James C. Reed and Myra Maybelle Shirley. If you listen closely in the silence after a wedding prayer, you can sometimes hear what's coming. The clatter of hooves that won't be outrun, the breathless laughter of a man who loves risk more than he loves sleep, the determined heartbeat of a woman who will not be mastered by hard luck or hard men. 2 children would follow, Rosie Lee, called Pearl, in 1868, and James Edwin, Eddie, in 1871. And with them a promise Belle kept to herself, that she would raise them to know the world as it is, not as people pretend it to be. Reconstruction, Texas was a tangle of new paper laws laid over old trail habits. A man might sign a lease in town before dinner and drift into a poker den after nightfall to test his luck or his nerve, or that half-formed plan he'd carried since the war. Jim Reed tried propriety the way a restless rider tries a fresh saddle. Hopeful at first, sore by sundown. He could run a string of cattle on hired pasture, then vanish 3 days on a trip no one could map. He had a way with charm and a way with trouble, and the two were cousins that never argued long. Belle learned the rhythms, the door that opened late, the low voices, the smell of horseflesh swapped hurriedly in the dark. She set plates anyway. She kept a lamp low in the window for a husband whose promises tended to arrive a week late and missing a word or two. The border war's old comrades, men who'd ridden for Quantrill or drifted beside the James Younger crowd, still prowled the gray places between soldier and thief. In parlors and porches from Dallas County to the Red River, people told it both ways. That Belle was the confidant who poured the coffee and tied off the whispers, that she was the instigator who traced routes on a table with one gloved finger and named which horse would be taken where. The truth, like river water, never holds still. What the records do hold is this. She married Reed in 1866. She bore Pearl in 1868 and Eddie in 1871. And Reed's world bent steadily from ranch work toward outlaw company, adrift as clear in hindsight as it was muddied in the living. On hot evenings, when cicadas sang like an overworked saw, Belle would sometimes slide from piano scales into silence, listening for that far-off dust that meant riders. The stage roads carried gossip faster than coaches, whispers of money shipments, whispers of strings of horses changing owners in the night. Now and then a deputy from across the line rode up with polite questions wrapped around a hard center. Belle met such men with the only armor a woman on the frontier truly owns: a steady gaze and a refusal to volunteer more than the law could prove. The newspapers, when they bothered to print Women Beyond the Society page, loved a story large enough to sell copies. Belle was already learning how a legend can outpace the facts by a county and a half. Conservative historians emphasize the uncertainty of Belle's direct participation in Reed's crimes, even as they confirm her proximity to the men in the milieu. What no paper printed was the ordinary heroism of her days. Stretching meal money, mending a boy's torn shirt, steadying a little girl's questions with a bedtime story told in a calm voice. Eddie was all angles and energy, forever scuffing boots and forever forgiven. Pearl watched everything with a kind of calm hunger, as if the world were a book she already knew how to read. Belle taught them both the frontier catechism: keep your mouth, mind your horse, and don't mistake talk for truth. In that house, the piano stood like a small, stubborn declaration that life had room for beauty even when the world insisted it did not. August 1874 put an end to the arguments that Jim Reed kept losing in private. Near Paris, Texas, a lawman with a warrant finally found the man who had spent months keeping half a horizon between himself and custody. The exchange was brief and unforgiving. A deputy sheriff's gun bucked. Reed fell. When the dust settled, there was a widow not yet 30 standing in air that smelled of powder and hot dirt, with 2 children wide-eyed at the edge of the road. The story traveled faster than grief can travel, slapped onto broadsides and tossed into saloons as a moral about fate or a boast about marksmanship, depending on who was telling it. Fact remains, Reed was killed near Paris in August 1874 while resisting arrest. Widowhood is an arithmetic problem on the frontier. How many meals can be made from the flour you have? How many hands can one woman be at once? A respectable livery might keep bread on the table. Sewing might add a few coins. Yet the rent on a safe life rarely balances on respectable alone. People would later claim that Belle ran a small stock operation that knew how to look the other way when a gelding's brand didn't line up with the story in the seller's mouth. Others swore she sheltered riders on the dodge, men who paid in silence and loyalty. In truth, the post-war stock economy was so soaked in gray transactions that a woman could dip a hand without knowing how far the stain would climb. Belle did what survivors do. She kept her children fed and her options open, a choice that sanctified her in some eyes and condemned her in others. Regional histories acknowledge local lore about Belle's stables and stock trading after Reed's death while cautioning against newspaper exaggerations. North of the Red River, the map turned strange to outsiders and familiar to those who knew how to read it. Indian territory was a patchwork: Cherokee land here, Muskogee Creek land there, with federal warrants crossing like storm fronts and U.S. deputy marshals riding out of Fort Smith as if the law were a long lariat and they were bent on catching the wind. Belle had kin and connections among the stars, a Cherokee family whose name already carried a metal taste on the tongue: whiskey, horses, cattle, and debts that found their way home at gunpoint. For a widow trying to thread the needle between danger and destitution, that country offered both a hiding place and a stage. She turned her eyes upriver along the Canadian, toward a green curve known by and by as Younger's Bend. The bend could be a sanctuary, a market, or a trap, depending on who knew you were there. Belle had a talent for being known just enough. Encyclopedia of Arkansas. Before she ever saw the bend, she learned its rules by rumor. Keep a second bridle where nobody but you can find it. Bury your best cash under a stone only your horse's hoof will step on. Never sell your last good mount to a man who won't look you in the eye. People said that up there a woman's word might be as valuable as a man's rifle if she learned when to speak and when to pour coffee and study a map. For a pianist raised on scales and Sunday manners, it might have sounded like the end of one life and the beginning of a risk too large to measure. For Belle, it sounded like air. She packed as if the road itself were a judge that wanted to see if she'd planned for its tempers. Flour, salt, coffee, cartridges, needle and thread, a small ledger, and the habit of writing things down even when she didn't intend to share them. Pearl tucked a doll into the crook of a saddlebag. Eddie refused to ride anything but fast. They moved in stages, 2 steps secure, 1 step uncertain, trading questions for miles, miles for a sleep that wasn't restful, and that sleep for the kind of morning when a woman can feel a new life standing just beyond the tree line, watching to see if she has the nerve to walk out and claim it. The nearer they drew to that river country, the clearer Belle felt the invisible lines, where federal authority thinned and local reputation thickened, where a deputy's badge weighed less than a neighbor's memory, where the word queen was not flattery, but a wager that you could keep order on your own ground. Somewhere inside that wager stood Sam Starr, younger than rumor made him, keen-eyed, a rider with the relaxed seat of a man who understands horses and the far look of someone who keeps 3 plans in his pocket. He would not appear all at once, but as a name repeated, a favor offered, a path opened that had been closed the day before. That was the horizon Belle rode toward, not a fairy tale throne, but a compound of log, cane, sweat, and a woman's will. Not jewels, but coffee at midnight for men who paid in quiet. Not fawning courtiers, but hired hands who understood that her say-so had the weight of a contract. It is fashionable to confuse power with noise. Belle understood power as the ability to decide who sleeps under your roof and who rides on. The road from widow to matron of a notorious bend was not a single leap, but a long series of small, exact steps, the kind a pianist takes, fingertip by fingertip, until a melody suddenly exists where a moment ago there were only keys. When she finally crossed into the shade of the blackjack oaks where the Canadian River slowed and turned, Belle had already made most of the choices people later pretended were made for her. She did not arrive as a victim. She arrived as a negotiator, with grief pressed flat and stored like a leaf in a ledger, with children in tow, with a reputation half fabricated by distant papers and half forged by the steady pragmatism of a woman who knows the price of every item on her table. The law would meet her there soon enough. So would the press. So would Judge Parker, by way of Fort Smith and a courtroom where velvet and plumes meant no more than dust. But first there would be Sam. First there would be the slow building of a river kingdom with a gate you could not see until you were already inside. On a night soft as breath, when the cottonwoods barely whispered, a rider turned in at a firelit yard and dismounted with a grin Belle would later tell herself she recognized from the first. His name was Starr. He asked for coffee. He asked for directions. He asked if the mare tied to her post had the stamina he'd heard about. Belle looked at the horse, then at the man, and gave her answer in a voice level as the river at dawn. The bend had found its queen, as much as any place can claim a person, and the next chapter was already walking toward her in boot heels that didn't hurry. The river makes its own decisions. It slides out of the hills, takes a long, lazy elbow where the banks are high, and the cane grows thick, and then keeps going as if no one ever tried to name it. Locals called that elbow Younger's Bend. Some said it honored Cole Younger. Others swore it was only a campfire tribute to notoriety, not a christening at all. Either way, the bend sat on the Canadian River, near where a lake would one day drown the old ferry crossings, and where a woman with a careful gaze could watch 2 miles of approach before a stranger reached her gate. That is where Belle, now calling herself Belle more often than May, set down stakes with a Cherokee rider named Sam Starr, and shaped a life that looked like a small kingdom to those who visited and a provocation to those who wore badges. The land they lived on was communal Cherokee land, tribal country, not parceled and platted, a place where a household could be anchored by kinship and reputation as much as by deed. In the early 1880s, outlaws found shelter there, whether they brought cash or only news, and the cabin's lamplight became a kind of frontier currency. The way station grew by little habits. Belle kept coffee ready and asked short, exact questions. Which ford? Whose cattle? What time? A ledger lived near the lamp, columns of feed, cartridges, and notes in a steady hand. Horses changed brands. Names changed, too, the way dust changes a face between morning and dusk. Sam handled the rougher edges of trade, but it was Belle who decided who sat and who rode on, who slept inside and who stayed by the coals. In a country where law arrived only after the saddle cooled, that was a kind of government. Visitors remembered biscuits, a dry blanket, and the feeling that the woman across the table saw farther than she let on. Later, writers would inflate these evenings into councils of war. The truth, as usual, was quieter, a refuge that doubled as a signal station, and a woman careful enough to make sure every favor bought a future favor back. Contemporary accounts confirm the Starr homestead as a familiar hideout and stopover on the Canadian. The grand conspiracies were often a newspaper's embroidery. All the while, the law at Fort Smith moved along its own channels. Judge Isaac C. Parker's court claimed jurisdiction over all of Indian Territory for years, a judicial reach so wide that Deputy U.S. Marshals rode with warrants folded in oilskin and covered tens of thousands of square miles between river bottoms and Blackjack Hills. The court was the only federal venue for the territory until 1883, when Congress began to divide jurisdictions with Texas and Kansas. Until then, the Western District of Arkansas was a single iron hub, and Parker's deputies struck out from Fort Smith like spokes in a wheel, 20 or 30 in the field at a time, far fewer than the 200 that press accounts loved to print, but enough for stories to start galloping. Without those deputies, Parker said, his court would be useless. Their boots knew the Canadians' cut banks almost as well as Belle did. In that landscape of overlapping laws, tribal and federal, a place like Younger's Bend was always being interpreted. Among the Cherokee, a person lived under the eyes of family and the light horse. Among non-natives moving through, federal law could pounce as soon as a brand didn't match a bill of sale. Belle learned to travel between these worlds with a kind of bilingual caution. Respect the elders, speak plain to the riders, never insult a deputy with theatrics, but never give him more than he already knows. She gave hospitality and asked for silence, the oldest trait in the West. And when she stepped outside in that black velvet hat later made famous by engravers, it wasn't costume so much as armor. A declaration that she intended to set the terms of her own dealings, whether the visitor at her gate wore wool or starched linen. Regional histories emphasize that the bandit queen image was amplified by Eastern papers. Day-to-day reality at the riverbend looked more like work, stock, meals, riders, reputation. The press loved her even before they truly knew her. Police Gazette illustrators sketched plumes and pistols for readers 1,000 miles away. Belle in lace, Belle with a 6-gun, Belle as a Lady Jesse James. Reporters who never saw Younger's Bend wrote like they'd taken supper there, and the exaggerations had their uses. A fearsome name can sometimes keep trouble outside your fence. But ink also draws lawmen the way a lantern draws June bugs. Every new story widened the circle of eyes watching the river. National weeklies built her up. Fort Smith felt obliged to test the legend against the statute book. As one historian put it, the romance of a woman leading thieves proved too strong for editors to let facts spoil the fun. The cast at the Bend never held still. Now and again you'd see Blue Duck pass through. Blueford Duck, Cherokee, manacled in that famous photograph beside Belle that later sent gossip clattering through saloons. He shot a farmer in 1884 and faced Parker's gallows 2 years later. The sentence was commuted to life, and some said the publicity surrounding that photograph helped. Did Belle herself hire counsel? Did she intervene? Later authors split. Some maintain she assisted the appeal. Others write that the photograph was a lawyer's stagecraft and that Belle's role was more symbol than substance. Whatever the case, the image hardened her aura. A woman who moved comfortably at the junction of outlawry and law, neither flinching from a camera nor from a courtroom door. At the Starr place, order depended on small agreements. Who fixed the fence? Who cut cordwood? Who could be trusted with the mare that never ran out of wind? Belle paid debts promptly and remembered slights longer than was good for any man. Sam was the friendly edge of the blade, quick to laugh, quicker to square a deal. But he carried a line of feuds behind him that reached into cousin branches and old grudges. Deputies learned his habits. Neighbors learned to stay cordial. Nights at the Bend looked like any other homestead. Bread sliced, tools mended, children put to bed, until the door scraped open and 3 riders stood full of dust and need. Then the little government of Belle Starr went into session. Food, terms, directions. Sometimes after the men were asleep, Belle would sit with the ledger and look past the lamplight at her fields. A queen? The papers made it grand. What she ruled was a handful of hard acres and the space inside her fence. It was enough. Beyond the fence, Fort Smith kept its rhythm. Jury impaneled, deputies sworn, warrants sealed. A train could carry a prisoner to Detroit faster than a season used to pass. The federal court had a way of turning stories into case numbers, and case numbers into sentences that did not care about plumes or velvet. Belle felt that weather change. The surprise visits by deputies became habits. Questions turned pointed. Names she had always spoken softly began to sound like they were already written down somewhere. She did not quake. She made a show of composure and doubled down on household order, as if discipline could hold back a river. Yet as the newspapers made her larger than life, the law narrowed its attention the way a hunter sights along a barrel. Men who'd once traded jokes at her gate traded statements in Fort Smith. You could see it in the silence that settled over the yard when riders dismounted. Less laughter, more sideways looks. Favors offered more carefully. News given with a price attached. Even the dogs learned to distinguish between a knock-you answer and one you let bounce off the door. Still, the Bend kept working. Corn came up between the stumps. Horses fattened. Children grew into chores. And through it all, Belle sat the saddle like a woman who understands that reputation travels faster than truth and must therefore be managed like a skittish colt. Some evenings she rode the cut-bank trails just to feel the Canadian's cool breath rise against her face. She would stop above the water and listen. Out there, the deputies were learning the same bends, the same crossings, the same tricks of moonlight and cane. It was becoming a chessboard, and both sides were improving with practice. When word came, not yet a warrant, but the shape of one, Belle tightened her circle. Fewer visitors at night. Stranger horses turned away with a polite lie and a firmer smile. She cut back on roads she didn't have to ride. She made friends with the clock, rising earlier, checking fences before the sun, counting everything that could be counted. You can govern a little kingdom by making sure nothing surprises you before noon. But the West has a way of teaching the same lesson twice. Attention attracts consequence. Younger's Bend, once a rumor of sanctuary, had become a place of interest to men who carried warrants and notebooks. The legend Belle neither courted nor entirely refused now rattled its spurs at her own door. The trials people like to tell around fires, who outfoxed whom, which deputy went home empty-handed, were about to be retold inside a courthouse, where stories lose their charm and gain a clerk's hand. On a night when the air lay heavy and sweet and the river kept secrets as it always had, Belle closed her ledger and blew the lamp down to a red eye. Soon the law would test her hospitality for evidence. Soon the ink that made her famous would be matched by ink that numbered her in a docket book. But not yet. For one more day, her kingdom by the river held. The mare's breath steamed in the dark. Somewhere in the cane, a quail called once and thought better of it. In the house, the children slept. And the woman everyone kept calling Queen listened to the quiet and planned how to hold her ground when morning came. The summons arrived the way iron weather arrives on the prairie. Quiet at first, then everywhere. Riders from Fort Smith nudged their horses into the yard at Younger's Bend, carrying the federal government folded in oilskin. A woman who had learned to read a man's face better than any statute watched them dismount and understood. The River Kingdom had a new kind of caller. She set out cups, steady as a church lady, and let the deputies speak. Somewhere inside the words, horseflesh, papers, custody, you could hear a courtroom being built plank by plank. In November of 1882, the charge was larceny of 2 horses. In March of 1883, a jury would make it official, and Judge Isaac C. Parker would turn the page from rumor to record. Fort Smith was no mere county seat. It was the hinge where Indian Territory swung against federal law. Parker's court claimed a reach of tens of thousands of square miles, one gavel presiding over a landscape of blackjack, cane, and red mud, and it moved with the relentlessness of a river in flood. 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, the docket marched. In his long tenure, Parker tried 13,490 cases, with 9,454 ending in guilty pleas or convictions. 160 death sentences were pronounced, 79 carried out on the Fort Smith gallows. A judge nicknamed the hanging judge insisted he never hung a man. The law did, but the spectacle of his court radiated outward like heat, and even those not charged with capital crimes felt that heat on their faces. Belle did. They brought her and Sam Starr into Parker's high-ceiling room the way you bring weather indoors. Lamplight on polished wood, 12 faces considering a woman in velvet who looked back as if to measure them at a glance. The United States Attorney was the formidable W.H.H. Clayton, a man whose name seemed carved into the very logic of the place. Some contemporary accounts say he prosecuted the Starr case himself, and if he did not, the machinery he had tuned since 1874 was grinding just the same. In a day when gossip passed for evidence in many saloons, Fort Smith demanded paper, witnesses, and a verdict that could travel by rail. When the jury returned guilty on March 8, 1883, Parker pronounced a measured sentence, 1 year in prison, lenient by his standards, and accompanied by a warning to become decent citizens. The law had spoken. The legend would have to wait its turn. If a courtroom turns stories into numbers, a prison car turns people into cargo. They left Fort Smith under guard, Belle the only woman among 19 convicts, the car clacking north toward a colder kind of border where river cane gives way to steel and brick. She did not whimper. She watched. She counted the miles by the rhythm of the rails and kept her face composed, as if dignity were a garment no one could seize. The destination had a name that sounded like a cough. DeHoco, the Detroit House of Correction, founded in 1861, a modern experiment in punishment whose corridors were already collecting their own grim folklore. There were work details, rules about the body and the clock, and a matron whose job was to catch weakness as it bloomed. The story that came back south later was simple. Belle behaved, Sam bristled. She served about 9 months and came home with a softer step and a harder eye. He returned with pride scuffed and tempers nearer the surface. Parker's clerk recorded it all in a hand that did not tremble. Charge, verdict, sentence, transfer. For a woman who had lived by favors given and returned in kind, the arithmetics of incarceration were a new ledger. Time was the currency, and she paid it by the day. There is a story Eastern papers like to print about her being a model prisoner, gaining the respect of the women's ward. Perhaps Belle had always prized composure. Prisons respect what they cannot break. The truth that matters is leaner. She endured what had to be endured, learned exactly how punishment feels when there is no ranch gate to ride through at dusk, and filed the knowledge away where useful cruelty is kept. Reachable, but not visible. Meanwhile, back along the Canadian River, Younger's Bend studied the wind. Every person who had ever slipped through Belle's gate had an opinion ready for the day she returned, that the law had finally humbled her, that the court had anointed her, that prison had only sharpened the blade. The National Park Service tells the plain fact. She was convicted of horse theft and sent to Detroit for a year. But even plain facts refuse to stay plain when a woman steps out of iron bars into a world set to speculate. It is a property of the frontier that a person's absence becomes a crowd of stories. Belle's absence had been profitable for storytellers. Her return promised more. On the day she crossed her own yard again, lamps trimmed, horses nickering, children watching as if someone important had come to visit, Belle did what a sensible queen of any small domain does. She inventoried her world. Fences mended, corn up, mare sound, ledger accurate. It is fashionable to say that jail crowned her, that she came back with a legend bigger than the river. The reality is cleaner. She came back a known quantity to deputies who had learned her ridgelines and approaches, a celebrity to editors who had never sipped coffee from her chipped mug, and a mother to 2 children who needed flour more than headlines. If power is the ability to decide who sleeps under your roof, she still had it. If freedom is the ability to ride any road you please, she had less of that than before. The river does not forget, and neither does a clerk's book. The press, those tireless carpenters of myth, hammered at her shape with renewed delight. Woodcuts and paragraphs arrived like late snow. Belle in velvet, Belle the female Jesse James, Belle the dangerous hostess of thieves. Each piece of ink pulled more deputy marshals along the cut banks. Men out of Fort Smith, hard-riding, underpaid, some of them veterans, some of them cowhands turned lawmen, made a practice of testing the stories people told about her against the facts they could write in a report. In Indian Territory, tribal authority, local custom, and federal statute met like three wary riders at a crossing. Belle had learned to speak to each. After Detroit, she learned when not to answer at all. Under the velvet hat, she refined her old policy: fewer visitors at night, shorter conversations at the gate, and no favors for men who could not keep their tempers tidy. There is an art to shrinking a legend without insulting the folks who came to admire it. Belle practiced that art with the same precision she once gave to piano scales. Still, the attention would not shrink. In 1886, facing another charge, she walked out of a courtroom with the case dismissed for lack of evidence, and the editors sighed collectively, disappointed not to have their sequel. The deputies didn't sigh. They merely tightened their reins and tried again the next day, because that is what law does when a person insists on living at the point where roads, laws, and reputations intersect. Did Dihoko change her? The romantic answer is that it made her either hard or holy. The visible answer is subtler. The woman who came back to the Bend from Detroit moved with a deliberate thrift of words, as if she had learned the price of every syllable. She still cut a figure: black skirt, plume, leather creak. But the drama now served a purpose: to keep certain men at a respectful distance and to make other men underestimate her. You could see it when a deputy tried a tone, and she returned it to him empty, like a cup he didn't deserve to fill. You could see it when a writer wanted more than coffee, and she answered with a direction that sounded helpful until he wrote it and found out it wasn't. Yet what most changed, perhaps, was time. A year sentence, 9 months served, and suddenly every day meant more. Sunrise was a resource, dusk a strategy. She walked her fence lines with the consciousness of someone who knew that boards and wire are not only for cattle, they are for defining jurisdiction. Deeds might be complicated in that country, but boundaries were not. This is mine. That is yours. The court had taught her a lesson the river had been whispering all along. Survival is a series of correct borders. So when the night fell blue and the river ran brown, and the wind lifted the cane as if to read it, the woman the nation called the Bandit Queen sat at her table with a ledger and a map, and made a math of her life that no editor could simplify. She had been measured and sentenced, carried north like freight, and brought back to the trail she knew best. If crowns exist here at all, they are made of habits. Who gets a blanket? Who gets a warning? Who rides away? And sustained by the stubborn conviction that a woman's house is not the government's to narrate. In the morning, the work would begin again. Corn to hoe, horses to shoe, coffee to pour, deputies to nod to with exactly the right temperature of respect. The gallows in Fort Smith would go on taking the breath from men with bloodier hands. Belle would go on breathing. For now, that was triumph enough. Winter comes to the river like a decision. The cane goes pale. The blackjack leaves crisp under boot. Even the dogs learn to waste no motion. December of 1886 found the Canadian River running low and cold, and the people around Younger's Bend living closer to their fires and their feuds. News had a shorter stride now. Rail lines carried letters and warrants as quick as a hawk's shadow. So when a Christmas dance was called near the bend, the invitation and the trouble arrived together. Lanterns swung from rafters. Fiddles were tuned. Men stood with that temporary grace, a dance lens even to gun hands. Belle watched the door the way a woman watches a weather front. She had good reason. The law did not stop for Advent, and old quarrels are the West's most reliable harvest. He came in from the cold, Frank West, a law officer with a badge and a memory, and the air for a heartbeat tightened the way it does when a gust meets the door. Some say West wore a deputy's star out of Fort Smith. Others remember him as a tribal policeman under Cherokee authority. The accounts disagree on the title, not the posture. A man of the law, and a man who knew Sam Starr far too well to be comfortable in the same room with him. One set of stories even says West and Sam were cousins, which in this country made a feud harder, not easier, to settle. What no story contests is what happened when words ran out. December 17th, 1886. Two men faced each other across the crowded light of a Christmas dance, hands moving toward iron as if the music had commanded it. Shots crashed through fiddle and talk. West took a bullet in the neck. Sam took one in the chest. In the stunned second after, while smoke wrote its crooked letters under the rafters, both men lay down the only truce the frontier truly recognizes. They died of their wounds. On the floor, someone cried out. A woman went to her knees. A boy was hustled toward the door by a man whose face had gone the gray color of ash. Belle stepped into the ragged circle and did what women do when the world breaks in public. She made a small privacy with her body, laid a hand on Sam's shoulder, and spoke to him in the voice she reserved for truth. If there were curses, the walls held them. If there were prayers, they were not for the room to hear. When she lifted her head, the legend of the Queen had no time for velvet. She was a widow for the second time, and the river kingdom she had governed with coffee, ledgers, and exact boundaries had just lost its useful king. The deputy marshals would ride less carefully now. Editors would write their satisfaction like a moral. Neighbors would watch to see which way her shadow leaned. The death of a husband changes the feel of timber. A yard gate that once swung with a man's hand on it now creaks as if questioning itself. Belle moved through the next days with deliberate economy. She ordered the grave, counted the stock, checked the pistol she kept behind the chipped crock of coffee. She spoke to hands who had never worked for her alone and let them know they were now working for her alone. In certain houses around the bend, people said good, that the river country would be quieter without Sam. In others, men shook their heads. The balance that had kept violence pointed outward from Belle's yard had been knocked off its nail. Out in Fort Smith, men accustomed to reading dockets read the newspapers as well. And the effect was what it always is when print and law line up. A tension focused like a rifle sight. It is one thing to be acquitted or to have a case dismissed. It is another to be left standing when the man everyone could blame for the ruckus is gone. Belle had slipped one case earlier that year, an 1886 theft charge thrown out for lack of evidence. But acquittals and dismissals do not make lawmen less curious. They make them more thorough. Riders on government horses grew familiar again with the cut banks and crossings by Younger's Bend. When they came, Belle met them with the same cool hospitality as before, only now there was no Sam leaning over the post to smile a man into relaxing the wrong inch. It is easy for later storytellers to make Sam's death the end of a chapter and the beginning of an epilogue. Life kept on in the middle voice. The corn needed tending. The mare still blew white in the cold. Pearl moved through the house with a grown girl's confidence. Eddie learned the kind of chores that take a boy's roundness off his face. The Starr kin turned up with sympathy that was genuine and advice that was not always welcome. Among them was Jim July, younger, Cherokee, keen with a rifle, and not from the sort of stock that keeps a safe distance from trouble. Belle and Jim found a common temperature. After Sam's death, they lived together, and by some tellings announced a common law union under Cherokee custom. Some say the arrangement was practical, a way for Belle to keep her stake in Cherokee country. Some say it was affection that refused to mind the calendar. It could be both. The frontier is large enough for more than one reason to be true. Meanwhile, the story engines back east kept turning. Police Gazette men drew Belle taller and prettier than any camera could, and the Bandit Queen headline, which had once worked like a scarecrow, began to draw crows. There is a difference between ruling a yard and ruling an image, and the second can betray the first. She understood this now in the particular, in the way a stranger's laugh changed when he saw her hat plume, in the tone a lawman used as if talking to a theater poster. She trimmed gossip with silence, the way you trim a wick to keep a flame controlled. It helped. It did not cure. Fort Smith still hunted outlaw networks. The Cherokee Light Horse still guarded tribal order. The federal court still made examples when it could. Belle had built a life on the boundary between these jurisdictions. Sam's death made the boundary colder. The practical changes were not dramatic to the eye, they were dramatic to the pulse. Belle shortened the hours of her hospitality, reduced the credit she extended, and sent riders on who once might have found a straw tick by her hearth. She tightened the circle of people who knew her routes and habits. The mare that had always stayed closer than a shadow now found herself tacked at odd hours for quiet loops along the cut bank. not for the romance of the thing, but to check the ground for fresh sign. There's a myth that queens are served. The frontier was built by women who served themselves first. Coffee, maps, resolve. And yet even then, there were nights of ease. A kettle sang. Pearl laughed at a joke that sent Eddie out the door red-faced. A neighbor woman came by with bread and left with sugar. Belle allowed herself to sit quiet and remember a young husband with too much charm and not enough discipline, a second with enough nerve for 3 men, and a smile that made her forget the calculation she ordinarily chose over hope. Memory has corners. She did not stay in any one of them long. The door could knock at any time, and the woman who opened it had no intention of letting grief make her careless. What did the deputies think? That she was weakened, surely. Widowhood has always been the law's favorite lever. But when they rode up, they met a household in order. Fences mended, stock counted, tools in their places, and a woman whose politeness felt less like surrender than like a boundary drawn with a steel rule. They noted the younger man at her shoulder, Jim July, quick-eyed, respectful, not talkative, and made a private arithmetic of what that might mean for warrants to come. Back in town, they wrote reports that did not say how. When they turned their horses at the gate, they felt a small, unwelcome respect for a yard that kept its shape despite everything. The world outside the bend narrowed while roads multiplied. Rail depots grew where field larks used to claim the dawn, and newspapers arrived as reliably as sunrise. Towns hired photographers to make proof of themselves. Judges called dockets that stretched like fences. The old codes, kin first, silence by safety, a woman's house is her law, were becoming harder to spend. Belle adjusted because she could do nothing else. She told stories shorter. She trusted closer. She wore her plume the way a man wears a holster, not as vanity, but as a signal. I will decide the terms of this conversation. And yet the math would not change. Sam was gone. With him had gone the man-sized space that kept some fools from testing her. Enemies grow braver when they sense a vacancy. Friends grow cautious when they fear the cost of loyalty. Somewhere in that triangle of law, legend, and loss, Belle lived day to day, making tiny sovereign decisions. Who eats, who rides, who is told the truth, until certain names began to surface more often in the talk at the mills and the ferry. A tenant with a temper, an old rival nursing a grievance, a family quarrel that had slept and woke wrong. She had weathered such weather before, but weather accumulates. It was hard to see just then that in the hush between lantern out and first rooster, the future had begun to rehearse itself along her home road. When winter loosened its hold, the bend looked almost like it always had. River brown, sky pale, yard swept, mare flicking an ear. Belle set her palm against the doorpost at dusk and felt the grain the way a person reads a scar. Whatever the press wrote, queen, Jezebel, outlaw lady, the actual crown she wore was this: order wrestled daily from a landscape that despises it. There's a nobility to that which needs no adjective. The law would return, as it always did. So would men with offers that were really tests and men with warnings that were really threats. She could meet them. She had the horse, the habit, the will. For now she banked the fire, tied the door, and felt the comfortable pull of fatigue where fear should have been. The Canadian slid by in the dark, not caring about reputations. Somewhere downstream, a trail she rode every week narrowed between the timber and her front gate. In a few years, men would claim they could see what was coming from a mile away. People always say that after. In the moment, a woman takes the step that is in front of her, and then the next, believing, because she must, that the road she knows will keep her safe. For Belle, that belief would be tested along a morning path in February, where the weeds still held frost and the day had not yet chosen its weather. But that is another chapter. For now, the house holds, the dogs settle, the river keeps its counsel. Morning comes thin and colorless along the Canadian, the kind of February light that pretends to be gentler than it is. February 3rd, 1889. A frost lies in the ragged weeds that edge the trail to Younger's Bend, and the ground under a mare's hoof feels like glass with a breath trapped inside it. Belle rides the familiar curve homeward, hat low, skirt dark as the cane, carrying the small necessities a household forgets until a woman remembers them. The dogs at her place will lift their heads when they hear the bit ring. The gate will complain in its old voice. If she's lucky, the kettle will be singing by the time she's thrown a leg down from the saddle. Somewhere between timber and yard, a presence waits. It could be a man standing quiet in the shadow of blackjack, gun low and patient. It could be a man kneeling, breath white, shoulder set against a tree where bark holds a crescent scar from an older winter. The stories never agree on the angle or the footing. They agree on the sound. A shotgun, the rude punctuation of a frontier argument that will not be debated. Buckshot tears the morning. Belle pitches forward from the saddle, hits the rutted road with the full consequence of gravity and surprise, and tastes the iron penny of blood. A second report closes the distance between danger and certainty. Some say the second blast took her face. Some say it found her back again. The detail matters to the men who draw diagrams. To history, the meaning is simpler and more terrible. Belle Starr is dead on her own home road. The mare shies and runs, rein snapping like a wiped sentence. Wind moves the cane as if trying to hide what it has just witnessed. In the house, someone hears what they think is a board breaking in the yard. When they find her, there's the stunned silence that follows any impossible fact. Then the clamor of names, instructions, the errand boy's sprint to fetch help no one can actually give. A sheet, a wagon, a voice whose calm breaks and has to be rebuilt word by word. Around the bend, the river keeps its old counsel. The deputies will come later, neat and official, with notebooks and grave faces. For now, the grief is private and unadorned. Who pulled the trigger? The frontier has more answers than indictments. Edgar E. Jim Watson, a tenant with a temper who had quarreled with Belle, is the name most tongues reach for first. Some neighbors remember threats and a rent dispute. Others tell it as if Watson had a broader grudge, the sort a man carries like an extra knife. There are those who point to family entanglements and jealousies, the volatile geometry that emerges when kin, livelihood, and pride cross the same small yard. A few even said Jim July, the younger man who stood nearest to Belle's days after Sam Starr died, had reason to fear what she knew or what she might decide. No sworn statement would ever rise up strong enough to cross a judge's desk and stand there. No court convicted anyone. On the frontier, some stories remain forever untied, like rope ends that the wind worries into fray. They lay her out in the house she had governed like a tight ship. Ledger shut, coffee tin cool, dogs baffled into silence. Then they carry her the short road to the place she will keep, buried at Younger's Bend under a marker that offers an epitaph too elegant for a life so scuffed by dust and iron. Shed not for her the bitter tear, nor give the heart to vain regret. 'Tis but the casket that lies here, the gem that filled it sparkles yet. Surinaway. A line like that comforts mothers and newspaper readers. It does not diminish the hard fact that a woman was shot down on the path to her own door and left to make the rest of her journey without breath. After the funeral comes the long echo. The National Police Gazette and a dozen other papers take hold of her image with both hands and pull. Woodcuts remake her into a creature of plumes and glances, velvet and audacity, a bandit queen whose court was a confederacy of horse thieves gathered for her amusement. The dime novel men, who never met a straight line they couldn't curl, string episodes into the shape of a career. In those pages, Belle orders robberies like a general directs maneuvers. She toys with lawmen as if they were suitors and rides from lark to lark in a swirl of lace. The truth is earthier and more difficult to romanticize. Ledgers, fences, coffee, children, favors traded in a world where law arrived on horseback and survival depended on knowing who to feed and who to turn away. The truth seldom sells as well as the costume, and yet legend is its own kind of fact. It tells us what a time needed from a name. Post-war America needed an emblem to hold all its contradictions about women in power. A figure who could soothe the appetite for scandal while letting readers imagine that order still held somewhere off stage. Belle Starr, the printed Belle, fit that appetite like a glove. She was both dangerous and decorative on paper, a contradiction easy to manage from a barber's chair or a parlor. Meanwhile, in the river country itself, the closing of the frontier was picking up its pace. Railroads stitched the map. Federal courts multiplied their jurisdictions. Tribal lands were hemmed in by policies written far from blackjack shade. The space in which a person like Belle could negotiate her own law grew smaller by the month. Perhaps that is part of why the country needed to crown her queen in print, so the old wildness could survive, safe on a page, while the real roads were being measured and fenced. If you follow the afterlives of such names, you find them in Hollywood and on bookshelves, each retelling sanding down an edge or bolting on a flourish. By the time an actress stands under a studio sun to play Belle with perfect hair and a revolver that clicks as clean as a metronome, much of what was unglamorous and essential about the woman is already in storage. The music of the life, children laughing in the yard, a mare's steady breathing, a ledger's tally of coffee, flour, and cartridges, a woman saying yes or no to a man who hopes to change her mind, rarely survives adaptation, but the outline remains recognizable. Missouri birth, Texas widowhood, Indian Territory sovereignty, Parker's Court, Detroit, return, ambush. You can hear it even when the orchestra drowns out the hoofbeats. If there is a way to lift the crown of legend without breaking what it rests on, it is to hold two truths at once. First, Belle Starr inhabited the outlaw trails as a note of hospitality and silence, a woman who understood the economics of refuge. She made a life from craft and grit, and she protected that life with the means available to her in a hard country. Second, the myth made from her name tells us as much about the people who composed it as it does about her. Their hunger for romance, their fear of female agency, their need to believe that the frontier could be personified in a single, stylish writer whose choices were always clearer than real choices ever are. What remains on the ground is plainer and perhaps more worthy of respect. The curve of the Canadian River is still a lesson in persistence. Water finds its path even under a lake that will later drown crossings and smooth the map. The yard at Younger's Bend, long vanished, then remembered, then guessed at again, was once the center of a politics small enough to hold in two hands. Who eats? Who sleeps? Who is told the truth? Who rides on? That governance, performed by a woman under pressure and watched by deputies riding from Fort Smith, deserves a more complicated word than queen, but the language we inherited defaults to crowns when it sees a woman stating terms. Perhaps the last measure of Belle Starr is not in whether she was more criminal than careful, more schemer than survivor, but in how the frontier itself behaved around her. It pressed, she held, it changed shape, she adapted. When at last the frontier answered with a shotgun instead of a warrant, the effect was not to erase her, but to etch her sharper in the public mind. The law could not solve the murder. The legend volunteered a dozen culprits and called the debt settled. Neither is wholly satisfactory. The river has the better explanation. It moves on, carrying in its silt the fragments of fence posts, the ash of old cook fires, and the memory of hoofbeats that once argued with the bank. Stand, if you like, at any bend where water slows under cottonwood and listen. The story will come back in pieces. Missouri girl, Texas bride, widow, Star's partner, prisoner, hostess of the hidden trail. Mark on the road where a second shot fell, and you will find yourself, as people have for more than a century, asking the only question that matters when legend and life braid together. Was she queen by design or by survival? The answer you choose will tell as much about you as it does about her. But if you honor what is difficult and durable in the past, you might say this: Belle Starr made order inside her fence and paid for it in coin and courage. The crown, like most crowns out here, was not gold. It was work.